The winter of 1811 fell hard upon the Bavarian village of Hohenberg. The snow stacked high against the eaves of narrow houses, the sky an endless gray sheet pressing down on the fields. It was in this bleak season that a child came into the world, and from the first moment the villagers whispered that something was wrong. The midwife, Frau Gertrude, had delivered dozens of infants, but when the slippery body of the newborn slid into her hands, she froze. The boy's eyes opened before he had even drawn a breath, and in that instant they did not seem the milky, unfocused orbs of a newborn. They seemed knowing, sharpened, and old. The child cried then, but the sound was not like other cries she had heard in all her years. It was fractured, low at first, then rising into a broken pitch, as if the wail had been split between two voices. The sound made the candles flicker in their holders, though no draught touched the room. The mother, pale and drenched in sweat, reached out in instinct to comfort her baby, but recoiled the moment his eyes met hers. It was not rejection of the child, but the recognition of something she could not put words to. She crossed herself and whispered a prayer. The midwife wrapped the boy in cloth, but when she placed him at his mother's breast, he did not fumble and root like other infants. Instead, he seemed to study her face, the corners of his mouth curling as though in grim satisfaction. "He is eager," the father said with a nervous laugh, trying to ease the heavy air in the room. But the nursemaid in attendance, a girl of 16, whispered that the child looked as though he had been waiting. Not born, but returned. By morning the house was filled with unease. Relatives came to see the newborn, but each left unsettled. One aunt later claimed the baby smiled when she entered, not with the fragile softness of infancy, but with the slyness of an adult. They named him Elias, a family name, but the choice did nothing to calm the whispering. The neighbors muttered that a cry like his was not of this world. In the following days, small details began to accumulate. The midwife noted that Elias did not sleep in stretches as babies do, but instead lay awake for hours staring into the rafters as though he were listening to some sound others could not hear. Once, when left unattended, he was found not in his cradle but on the floorboards beneath it, the swaddling still intact, as if he had rolled or placed himself there deliberately. The mother insisted she had not moved him. The midwife swore the child could not have done so alone. But the most troubling thing came on the 7th night, when Frau Gertrude was summoned again. The mother claimed that Elias had been crying in his sleep, not the hungry cry of a newborn, but words. Garbled, thick, but unmistakable syllables straining to form. When the midwife held him, the child's tiny lips shaped a sound that chilled her marrow. He seemed to whisper her name. The tale spread quickly. By the next Sabbath, the congregation sat stiff in the chapel pews, stealing glances at the family. Some argued that children carried traits of the ancestors, that strange behaviors were not signs of the devil but of bloodlines. Yet beneath their words was a trembling fear, for the cry of Elias still echoed in their ears, and no one could shake the sense that this was no ordinary beginning. The priest prayed over the boy, sprinkling him with holy water. But even as the droplets touched his forehead, his eyes remained fixed, unblinking, upon the crucifix above the altar. For a heartbeat too long, it felt as though Elias was not a child being blessed, but a witness remembering something already seen. something already endured. And when he cried again, it was softer this time, but still wrong, still heavy with the weight of familiarity. The village had welcomed many births, but none before had sounded like a memory. The family brought in a wet nurse from the neighboring town, a woman named Marta Renz. She was broad-shouldered, practical, a mother herself 3 times over, and she carried the confidence of someone unshaken by superstition. When she first saw Elias swaddled tightly in linen, she gave a dismissive chuckle. "Every village thinks their child is different," she told the parents. "But milk quiets all cries." She pressed the child to her breast, humming an old lullaby as she settled into her work. For a few hours everything seemed ordinary. Elias fed greedily, his small fists pressing against her skin. But when the feeding ended, Marta leaned back in her chair, her face pale. She did not speak of it then, but she swore she had felt something unnatural, as though the child's mouth carried not hunger but intention. His gaze traveled up her chest, locking on her eyes with such force that she nearly dropped him. She put him back in the cradle, her hands trembling, and told herself exhaustion was playing tricks. By the following morning, the house was filled with unease. The mother awoke to find Marta sitting by the cradle, silent, her arms folded tight across her chest. She had not slept. When asked what was wrong, she only muttered that the child was too aware. Later, when pressed by the father, she confessed that during the night she had felt Elias's eyes on her, unblinking as though he were waiting for her to make a mistake. She swore she had heard him exhale a sound that was not a cry but a sigh, a sound of recognition, as if he already knew her. The family begged her to stay, reminding her of the payment promised. Marta nodded stiffly, but that night she again refused to sleep. At some dark hour, when the house was hushed and the wind rattled the shutters, she claimed the baby had whispered. She would not say the words aloud, but she told the mother it was a name she had not heard in 20 years. A name that no one in this house should have known. At dawn, Marta announced she could not remain another day. She left without her pay, without farewell, her steps hurried as if pursued. Hours later, the father found the bundle of her discarded cloths near the back gate. They were stiff with blood. No body accompanied them. She had vanished into the snow. Rumors spread fast. The villagers muttered that Marta had seen something no nurse should see. Some said she had gone mad, others that she had been taken by wolves. But one detail lingered. Those who had entered the house that morning spoke of the baby's expression. They swore Elias had not cried for milk, nor whimpered for warmth. Instead, he looked pleased, his lips curling faintly as though savoring some private triumph. By the week's end, Marta's absence became a scandal. Her husband arrived from their town demanding answers. He raged at the family, claiming his wife would never abandon her children. Yet the only thing he carried back was that blood-stained bundle. He buried it as though it were her coffin. No explanation ever surfaced. In the nights that followed, Elias grew restless. He stared more often at the door, as if expecting someone to return. The mother swore she once heard him chuckle in his sleep, a broken rasp that made her clutch her rosary. The priest urged calm, but his voice wavered when he heard the tale of Marta's last hours. It was as though the village was caught in a slow tightening of threads, each event small, but together weaving a noose. Some said the boy had driven the nurse away with nothing more than his stare. Others claimed she had carried guilt of her own, and Elias had seen it. For when she vanished, she left not only blood behind, but silence. And silence, the villagers would learn, was more terrifying than screams. The house grew colder, as though the absence of the nurse had hollowed it. Elias thrived nonetheless, his skin pink, his body strong, his eyes always watching. He gurgled and cooed, but beneath the sounds was something else, a cadence that made the mother's skin crawl. The family did not know it then, but the vanishing of the nurse was not an end. It was the beginning of the boy's first shadow, the first sign that wherever Elias was, those around him would not leave unscathed. By the time Elias reached his 3rd year, he could walk with a steady gait and speak in full sentences. The family, relieved that he had grown into a healthy child, began to believe the strange events of his infancy had been exaggerations born of fear. Yet the unease never fully left them, for Elias spoke with a clarity that was uncommon for his age, and often about things no child should know. One winter evening, as the fire crackled low in the hearth, Elias sat quietly by his mother's side, staring into the flames. Without prompting, he whispered that he remembered another fire long before this one. His mother thought he meant a dream, but Elias corrected her. He said it was a fire he had seen at his first birth. The words startled her, and she asked what he meant. Elias explained calmly and without hesitation that he had been born twice. Once before in another house to another mother. He spoke of walls painted in a pale color, of hands that held him but shook with fear, of screams that ended too suddenly. The father dismissed it as a child's imagination, but the details grew more troubling. Elias began to name places he had never seen. He spoke of a cellar with dirt floors, of candles placed in circles, of the sharp smell of iron. When asked how he could know such things, he only replied, "Because I was there." The most disturbing came when he mentioned names of villagers long dead. He said he had seen them not as a visitor, but as someone bound to them. At first, the parents tried to hush him, but soon others heard his strange recollections. At gatherings, Elias would point to elderly villagers and murmur fragments of their past, things buried and never confessed. One man fled the room in terror when Elias calmly told him how his first wife had died, alone in her kitchen, her mouth filled with blood. It was a detail the man had never spoken aloud. The priest was summoned, and Father Anselm sat Elias on his knee, asking careful questions. The boy's answers chilled him. Elias described a birth where the midwife's hands trembled, where the air was heavy with the smell of salt and ash. He said he remembered opening his eyes to see the priest standing there, though Father Anselm had never delivered a child. When asked how he could have known this, Elias only said, "You watched." Word spread through the village like rot through timber. Some whispered Elias carried the soul of another, cursed to live twice. Others feared he was no child at all, but a vessel, a hollow body filled with something that remembered death too clearly. The family tried to protect him, but already the boy had marked himself as different. The villagers, once curious, now crossed themselves when he passed. Children avoided him. And Elias, though still small, seemed to understand what his words had done. He did not stop speaking of his first memory. If anything, he shared it more often, as if repeating it gave him strength. For Elias, memory was not a dream. It was a wound, open and unhealed, and every time he touched it, the village felt the sting. Father Anselm was a man of rigid faith, a priest who had weathered the changing moods of his parish with steady sermons and stern discipline. He had known hunger, plague, and war, and he thought there was little left in the world that could disturb him. But when word of Elias's strange recollections reached him, he felt an unease he had not known since his youth in seminary. He told himself that children often spoke in riddles, that the devil used the tongues of the innocent to spread confusion. Yet when he saw Elias with his own eyes, doubt began to gnaw at him. The boy was brought to the chapel on a cold morning, his parents leading him by the hand. Elias walked without fear, gazing at the carved saints, the gilded altar, and the shadowed corners of the sanctuary with a composure that unsettled the priest. Most children clung to their mothers when entering such a solemn place, but Elias wandered forward as if he recognized it, as though he were returning to a familiar room. Father Anselm knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Tell me," he asked softly, "do you know where you are?" Elias looked up at the crucifix and nodded. "I was here before. You were here too. You prayed, but not for me." His voice was calm, almost pitying, and in it the priest heard not the tremble of a child, but the certainty of memory. The words struck Anselm like a blow. How could this boy speak with such assurance? He pressed further, asking Elias what he remembered. The boy's eyes darkened as he described an earlier birth, one that had taken place in secret beneath the floor of this very chapel. He spoke of candles that dripped onto stone, of prayers that were not Latin but something harsher, older. He said the priest had stood in the shadows watching, though Anselm swore to himself that such a thing had never occurred. Yet the more the child spoke, the harder it became to dismiss him. Elias described a wound carved into his tiny body, a mark hidden from sight. He said he had bled not as a newborn should bleed, but in lines and patterns. He said someone had whispered over him, "He will come again." The words made the priest's skin crawl. That night, Father Anselm found sleep impossible. He lit a lantern and descended into the chapel's cellar, a place used for storing grain and wine. As he moved between the barrels, his light caught on something scratched into the stone floor. Lines, faint but deliberate, forming a circle no larger than an infant's body. He felt the air tighten around him, cold despite the lantern's heat. His heart thundered, for though the villagers spoke of superstition, here was evidence carved into the church itself. Anselm returned upstairs trembling. He tried to convince himself it was coincidence, old graffiti, the marks of masons. But Elias's words echoed in his skull. "You watched." It was as if the boy knew something buried deep, something even Anselm dared not confess to himself. Over the weeks that followed, the priest kept Elias close, questioning him in small, careful ways. Each time the child offered fragments that cut deeper. He mentioned the sins of villagers that no one had spoken aloud: theft, infidelity, secret cruelty. And once, while sitting in the pews, Elias leaned close and whispered into the priest's ear. He named a penance Anselm had given decades earlier in another parish to a man who later hanged himself in despair. It was a detail the priest had never shared, one he had hoped God alone had witnessed. Anselm recoiled, his lips trembling with prayers that brought no comfort. He began to watch Elias with a wary eye, torn between fear of the child and fear for him. For if Elias truly carried memories of another life, then the boy was not merely cursed. He was a mirror held up to the village, showing them their own hidden sins. And mirrors, Anselm knew, could shatter. The unease surrounding Elias swelled until it pressed against every corner of the village. By then, Father Anselm had grown quieter in his sermons, his eyes often straying toward the boy seated with his family in the pews. He carried his secret of the carved circle beneath the chapel, yet spoke of it to no one. Still, something heavier lingered in the air, and in time that silence broke. It began with a stench. In early spring, when the snows melted and water seeped into the earth, villagers claimed a foul odor rose from the old midwife's home. Frau Gertrude had fallen ill months earlier and no longer took patience, shuddering herself inside. When her neighbors knocked, they heard nothing. Days passed until a group forced the door. The house was empty, its hearth cold, but the smell clung to the air like rot woven into the walls. One of the men noticed disturbed earth in the cellar, the dirt floor uneven as if something had been buried in haste. They dug, and within the hour their shovels struck bone. The body was small, fragile, the skeleton of a girl perhaps 12 years old. But what horrified them was not the discovery of death. It was the manner of it. The arms and legs had been bound with copper wire that had bitten into the bone. The teeth had been broken and arranged inside the rib cage in a crude pattern. This was no burial. This was a display. The news spread like wildfire, and the villagers gathered at the threshold in horrified silence. Some cried for the priest. Others whispered that Elias had spoken of a first mother, that this corpse might be tied to him. When the boy arrived with his parents, he walked down into the cellar without hesitation. He stood before the unearthed remains, his face pale but calm. Then, to the shock of all, tears welled in his eyes. He pressed his small hands together and whispered, "My first mother." She held me, then she was gone. The villagers gasped, retreating from him as though he were plague-stricken. The father seized his son, shaking him, demanding how he could know such a thing. But Elias only wept harder, repeating the words until his voice broke. The mother collapsed against the wall, clutching her rosary, while the priest crossed himself with trembling fingers. The midwife, Frau Gertrude, was nowhere to be found. Some believed she had fled to escape punishment, others that Elias's words had driven her to the wilderness. But those who had seen the bones felt certain she had not acted alone. The binding, the broken teeth, the ritual precision, it spoke of method, not impulse. It was as if someone had been experimenting, turning the body into an instrument for something unspeakable. For weeks afterward, the cellar remained sealed, guarded by fearful villagers who dared not linger near it. Yet whispers continued, always circling back to Elias. How could he have known? Why had he named the dead as his mother? The boy did not deny it, nor did he try to explain. He seemed more sorrowful than afraid, as though the sight of the skeleton confirmed what he had always carried in silence. Father Anselm visited him one night, hoping to draw truth from the child. But Elias only said, "I have been born twice, Father, and not all mothers live." The priest left the house shaking, his stomach clenched in dread. The discovery of the body had changed the village forever. Before, Elias had been a curiosity, a child touched by strangeness. Now he was something far darker, a living link to death, a boy who remembered bones. And the villagers understood what it meant. If there had been one body hidden beneath their feet, there could be more. Months passed after the discovery in the cellar, but the village did not recover. The body of the young girl lay in a hastily dug grave outside the chapel walls, forbidden a place in consecrated ground. The midwife had vanished, leaving only questions that festered in silence. Elias grew, his face thinner now, his eyes more solemn, as though he bore the weight of two lives. His presence unsettled even the devout, and families drew their children close whenever he passed. But the boy remained watchful, patient, as if waiting for something. Then one mist-choked dawn, Marta Renz returned. The wet nurse who had fled years before stumbled into the village square, her clothes tattered, her body gaunt. Her skin clung tight to her bones, and across her chest were scars. Thick, puckered lines carved into patterns that seemed deliberate, not random. Some swore they saw symbols etched in her flesh, circles and jagged strokes that twisted like letters from an unknown tongue. She collapsed before the chapel, her mouth foaming, her voice torn from screaming. The villagers gathered, horrified. Marta had been gone so long many assumed her dead. Now she crawled on her hands, clawing at the earth, raving in broken words. When Father Anselm knelt beside her, she clutched his robe with bleeding fingers and spat out fragments of a tale too twisted to believe. She spoke of being taken, of rooms lit by weak lanterns, of hands forcing her onto stone tables. She said they had carved her, not to kill her, but to open her, to make her body a vessel, a chamber where something could be carried. She repeated one phrase over and over, each time more frantic. The boy was not born. He was brought back. Her words spread through the crowd like poison. All eyes turned toward Elias, standing at the edge of the gathering. He did not cry or hide behind his mother. He stared at Marta with a solemn, almost mournful expression, as though her suffering were not a revelation to him, but a confirmation. For a long moment their eyes locked. Then Marta screamed a perle, a piercing wail that made even the strongest men recoil. She screamed not in fear, but in recognition. Her voice cracked as she shouted, "It is him! He remembers what he should not. He carries them all." She was carried away to a hut at the edge of the village, too weak to walk, her body shaking with fever. Women tried to tend to her, but she refused food and water, thrashing whenever Elias's name was mentioned. Her scars oozed, reopening as though they resisted healing. On the third night she died, her mouth frozen in a grimace of terror. Her hands clawed at her own chest as though trying to tear something out. The priest insisted she be buried quickly, but her death did not end the fear. Her return had shifted the air in the village. What had once been superstition now felt like fact. She had spoken of rituals, of Elias not being a child of ordinary birth. And the scars across her flesh were testimony no sermon could erase. Elias himself changed after Marta's death. He grew quieter, but there was a depth in his gaze that unsettled all who met it. He no longer played with the few children who dared approach him. Instead, he wandered near the chapel, tracing his fingers along its stone, pausing often at the door to the cellar. His mother begged him to stay indoors, but Elias only said, "I know where I came from." The villagers whispered at night. Some believed Marta had been mad, her scars self-inflicted. Others argued no human hand would carve such symbols without purpose. And more than one voice said Elias was not a child, but an experiment, a vessel forged by hands that defied God. The truth of Marta's words could not be proved, yet her broken body, her screams, her claim that Elias had been brought back lingered in every mind. For if she had suffered so much, then her final cry must hold weight. And the boy, standing silent as her corpse was lowered into the ground, gave no denial, no protest. He simply watched, his small hand pressed against his chest as though he knew the secret better than anyone else. The year Elias turned 6, the village children grew wary of him. They no longer played near his home, no longer invited him to join their games in the meadow. He seemed content to linger on the edge of their laughter, watching with those dark, knowing eyes. Some pitied him, others feared him, but none could deny that wherever Elias walked, silence followed. Then came the death that sealed his place as something more than strange. It was late summer when the body of young Lucas, the miller's son, was found in the village well. His parents had searched frantically when he failed to return home, and by lantern light the men hauled him up from the black water. His skin was pale, his limbs stiff, yet when they opened his mouth expecting to find the drowned lungs of a child, there was no water inside. Instead, his veins and chest cavity held something that made the physician step back in horror. Shards, sharp and glistening like splinters of glass, filled the spaces where his blood should have been. They clinked as they spilled onto the floor, a sound more terrible than any cry. The villagers recoiled, whispering of witchcraft, of curses older than memory. No drowning could explain it, no fever nor accident. The body was an abomination, a riddle carved in flesh. As the crowd gathered around the well, Elias arrived with his parents. He looked upon the body of Lucas without surprise, his small face pale in the lamplight. When his mother tried to cover his eyes, he pushed her hand away. His lips parted, and in a voice as steady as the priest's own, he whispered, "I remember this death." The words froze the crowd. Some spat on the ground, others crossed themselves, backing away as though from a plague. The miller, broken with grief, lunged forward, shouting that Elias had cursed his son, that his strange eyes had stolen the boy's breath. Elias did not protest. He only kept staring, whispering the words again, softer this time, as though to himself. "I remember." That night, panic swept through the village. Families locked their doors, kept their children close, and lit candles that burned until dawn. No one could explain the shards inside Lucas's body. No one could explain why Elias had spoken as though he had lived the death himself. Fear turned quickly to anger, and whispers began to spread that the boy must be cast out or worse. Father Anselm stood before the villagers, trying to calm them, insisting that Elias was only a child. Yet even the priest's voice shook when he recalled how Elias had described the cellar, how he had named sins no one had spoken aloud. The lines between innocence and guilt had blurred beyond recognition. In his home, Elias grew restless. His mother found him awake in the small hours, sitting upright, murmuring fragments she could not understand. When she touched his shoulder, he flinched and told her, "The memories are stronger at night." She held him close, but his small body trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of something larger than childhood. The death of Lucas was buried beneath hasty prayers. his coffin lowered with the sound of broken glass still echoing in the minds of those who had seen. But the village did not forget. They looked to Elias now not as a strange child, but as a harbinger. Wherever he was, death seemed to follow. And in the silence that grew heavier with each passing day, one truth began to root itself in every heart. Elias was no longer simply living among them. He was carrying something, and with each death it was growing stronger. The death of Lucas had shaken the village into silence, but it had also driven Father Anselm into restless study. He could no longer dismiss Elias as a troubled child, or Marta's ravings as madness. There were too many patterns, too many pieces that did not belong to chance. At night he descended into the chapel's archives, dust thick on the leather-bound volumes, the air heavy with the scent of mold and ink. He pored over records written centuries earlier, long before his appointment, when Hohenberg was little more than a cluster of huts on the edge of the forest. It was there, in a crumbling folio bound with frayed twine, that he found the first whisper of something darker. The text described a group of men, half physicians, half priests, who had gathered in secret during years of plague. Their purpose was not healing, but conquest over death. They called themselves the Circle of the Second Womb. Their experiments were not written in detail, but fragments told enough. Unborn children cut from their mothers, organs preserved in salt, blood transfused from dying men into the living womb. Their aim was not to save lives, but to bind memories, to force the soul of the dying into the body of the unborn. The priest recoiled from the pages, his stomach turning, but he could not stop reading. The writings claimed success was rare, most infants born lifeless or twisted, but once, only once, a child survived and spoke of things it could not know. The record ended abruptly, as if silenced, but one phrase was underlined by a shaking hand. "He will come again." Father Anselm sat frozen, the words burning into him. He thought of Elias, the strange birth, the midwife, the nurse's scars, the child's recollections, the deaths. Could it be that this boy was not cursed by accident, but designed? Driven by fear, Anselm questioned the oldest villagers, men and women whose minds were brittle with age. Most shook their heads or muttered prayers, but one widow confessed in hushed tones that her grandmother had spoken of the doctors of rebirth. She said they met in hidden rooms not only in Hohenberg but in other towns, passing their methods in coded notes. When asked what they sought, the widow whispered, "To make memory stronger than the grave." The priest pressed further and found that Marta's scars bore resemblance to symbols once used by this secret order. Marks meant to open the body as a vessel, not kill it. Her torment had not been random cruelty. It had been ritual, the continuation of forbidden practice. With each revelation, Elias's life began to make sense in a way that was more terrible than mystery. He was not simply a child haunted by another birth. He was the success of their experiment, living proof that the second womb could bind memory to flesh. The boy was a vessel, carrying not only his own brief life but the fragments of others. Each death he remembered was not imagination but inheritance. Yet Anselm knew the village could never learn this truth. If they understood Elias was the work of men, not God, their rage would turn into something more dangerous. He wrestled with his conscience, torn between confession and silence. Meanwhile, Elias wandered the streets, watched with suspicion by every eye. He seemed more solemn than before, his childhood stripped from him. One afternoon, as he sat outside the chapel, he said softly to the priest, "They are still here." When asked what he meant, Elias replied, "The ones who made me. They do not die. They wait." The words chilled Anselm more than the archives. If the circle of the second womb still existed, their work was unfinished. And Elias, their proof, might only be the beginning. That night, as the priest sealed the archive and locked it tight, he knew the village had been living in the shadow of something vast, hidden beneath centuries of silence. The boy was not their curse alone. He was the echo of a society that had never stopped reaching into the womb, never stopped binding death to birth. And somewhere, in unseen corners, they might still be watching, waiting for Elias to fulfill what they had begun. The archives had unsettled Father Anselm, but it was what lay beneath the chapel that broke him. For weeks he avoided descending into the cellar again, telling himself the circle scratched into the floor was old graffiti, nothing more. Yet Elias's words would not leave him. "This is where I died first." The boy's gaze lingered too often on the chapel doors, his small body trembling whenever bells rang for Mass, as though the building itself carried a memory too heavy for him to bear. One evening, after dismissing the congregation, Anselm remained alone in the nave. The candles flickered low and the silence pressed against him like a living weight. He took a lantern and descended the narrow steps to the cellar. The stone corridor stretched deeper than he remembered, leading to a wall where the mortar looked disturbed. His trembling fingers pressed against it, and with effort he shifted a loose stone. Behind it yawned a passage, dark and stale with the smell of damp earth and iron. The priest hesitated, but the pull of dread was stronger than fear. He entered. The passage led down to a chamber carved into the bedrock, larger than the chapel above. His lantern illuminated walls etched with symbols, circles within circles, sharp angles intersecting like knives. Along the floor stood altars of rough stone upon which rested mannequins made of wax and cloth, shaped crudely into the forms of infants. Their mouths were painted black, their bodies pinned with rusted nails. Dried stains marked the floor around them as if blood had once been poured in deliberate patterns. Anselm staggered back, clutching the crucifix at his chest, whispering prayers that felt weak in the presence of such carefully crafted horror. This was no place of storage, no accident of design. This was a ritual chamber, a womb beneath the house of God where flesh and memory had been twisted together. As he stood frozen, a soft voice carried through the passage. Elias had followed him. The boy stepped into the chamber without hesitation, his lanternless figure small against the towering shadows. He looked at the wax infants, his lips trembling, then walked toward one in particular. His hand reached out, resting gently upon its misshapen head. "This is where I died first," he said, his voice neither childlike nor fully human. It was a tone heavy with sorrow, as though he spoke not only for himself but for all who had lain upon those stones. The priest tried to lead him away, but Elias resisted, his small frame stiff with defiance. "They made me here," he whispered, "and they will make more." His eyes flickered toward the walls, to the carvings that glowed faintly in the lantern light. For a moment it seemed almost as if the boy remembered each line, each cut of the chisel, as though he had watched them being carved centuries earlier. Anselm felt the truth clawing at him. This was no accident, no superstition. The circle of the second womb had carved their doctrine into the foundation of the chapel itself. Their rituals had taken place here, beneath sermons and hymns, beneath centuries of faith. And Elias was their legacy, walking proof that memory could be bound to blood. He dragged the boy back up the stairs, sealing the passage behind them, but the images would not leave him, nor would the fear. For if Elias had been made once, he could be made again. And if the chamber still existed, untouched and waiting, then perhaps the circle's work had never truly ended. The chapel was no longer a house of God. It was a womb of the dead. Marta Renz's body had been laid in the cold ground weeks earlier, but her scars haunted the minds of the villagers. They were too deliberate, too cruel to dismiss as madness. Father Anselm, tormented by the chamber he had seen beneath the chapel, summoned a traveling physician from Munich, a man named Dr. Ulrich Falk, known for his skill in anatomy and his lack of patience for superstition. Anselm hoped the physician would provide reason where faith had failed. The body was exhumed at dawn, the villagers gathering in silence as if expecting Marta to cry out from her coffin. She was carried into the physician's care, her flesh already gray and stiff. In the dim light of the parish house, Dr. Falk set to work, his instruments gleaming as though mocking the solemnity of the task. He cut with precision, peeling back skin to reveal the lattice of scars. His brow furrowed, his lips tight with a discomfort he would not admit. The patterns across her chest and abdomen, he explained, were not wounds of attack but incisions crafted with intention. These were not made to kill her, he said, voice low. They were made to open her, to keep her alive while something was done within. The villagers pressed closer, their faces pale with horror. Falk lifted a length of thick scar tissue and traced its path downward. The womb was their target, he whispered. Inside he found the evidence, tubes. Thin reeds, hardened with resin, had been inserted deep into her womb. The ends were burnt, suggesting they once carried liquids, perhaps blood, perhaps salt water, perhaps something darker. Her spine bore fractures not from accident but from pressure applied in measured intervals, as if her very frame had been forced into compliance. Her organs were scarred, some shriveled, as though drained and replenished again and again. This is no butchery, Falk concluded grimly. This is design. Whoever did this sought to make her body a vessel, a living experiment. The words cracked the last fragile barrier of denial. The villagers erupted in fear and disgust, some calling it witchcraft, others blasphemy. Yet Anselm heard in Falk's explanation the echo of what he had read in the archives. The circle of the second womb had not been myth. Marta had been their subject, her womb carved into a chamber meant to carry more than life. As the physician worked, Elias stood at the doorway, silent, his eyes fixed on Marta's remains. He did not look away when Falk held up a shriveled organ, nor when he revealed the tubes coiled within her. Instead, Elias coughed, his small body racked with spasms. When his mother rushed to him, she froze. His lips dripped with blood, not fresh but dark and metallic, and the smell that rose from it was sharp, like rust and ash. The physician hurried to his side, wiping the child's mouth, but the blood kept coming in thin streams. Falk's face drained of color. This is not illness, he whispered to Anselm when the boy was carried away. "This is correspondence. The boy bleeds because the body bleeds. They are tied." The thought struck Anselm with crushing clarity. Elias was no miracle of survival. He was the continuation of the ritual carved into Marta's flesh. Whatever they had done to her, they had succeeded in him. And now, with Marta dead, Elias bore the burden alone. That night, the physician left the village, claiming his work was finished. But his hands trembled as he packed his instruments, and his eyes darted to Elias as though the child were not a boy but a wound left open. He promised to write of his findings, but no letter ever came. Some believed he destroyed his notes, unwilling to leave behind proof of what he had seen. The villagers buried Marta again, but unease lingered. They whispered of the tubes, of the broken spine, of the boy's blood that smelled of iron and ash. Each fragment of truth pushed them closer to madness. For if the circle had once succeeded in creating a vessel, what would stop them from doing so again? And Elias, pale but unbroken, seemed to know this. He sat by the chapel wall, coughing softly, his hand pressed to his chest. "They will not stop," he murmured one evening to no one in particular, "because I am proof." The proof of suffering made into science. The village that once whispered only in fear now began to crumble under it. The death of Lucas, the scars upon Marta, the chamber beneath the chapel, the boy who bled rust and ash. Each revelation had been a crack in the walls of faith. By the spring that followed, those cracks split wide. Children began to vanish. It started with a single cradle found empty at dawn. The mother swore her baby had been beside her through the night, bundled against her chest. Yet when the cock crowed, the blankets were folded neatly, the child gone. There was no broken latch, no footprints in the mud. It was as if the infant had been lifted by invisible hands. A week later, another child disappeared, this one from the miller's loft, though the ladder had not creaked and the shutters remained latched. The villagers searched the forest, the river, the fields. Nothing. When the bodies returned, they were not whole. Each small corpse was discovered in places no one wished to look: the hollow of an old oak, the edge of a frozen brook beneath haystacks already turned to rot. Their chests were cut open, hollowed clean. No heart, no lungs, no blood. Only salt crystals packed into their cavities, as if the body itself had been preserved against time. Their eyes were gone too, leaving sockets stuffed with ash. The sight of them drove mothers to wailing and fathers to fury. Doors were barred, prayers whispered louder. But the disappearances did not cease. Each week brought another empty cradle, another corpse salted and returned. Fear hardened into rage, and rage looked for a name. It found Elias. They said wherever he walked, the air grew colder. They said his coughs echoed like prayers twisted backwards. They said he watched the grieving parents with an expression too knowing, too calm. The miller's wife screamed in the square that her son had died because Elias had remembered it first. Others agreed, though none dared approach him directly. When confronted, Elias did not deny. He stood in silence, his small body still, his gaze steady. Finally he whispered, "It is not me. It is what made me. It will not stop." But his words fell into the pit of their terror, and few listened. Father Anselm tried to protect him, to calm the villagers, but his own faith was unraveling. He could not banish the memory of the chamber, of the circle carved into the stone. The deaths were not random. They were echoes of the ritual. Each hollowed body was a continuation, each salted chest a sign that the circle's hand had not faded with time. Elias was not the cause, but the consequence. He was proof of their success, and now the village paid the price. At night the bells tolled not for prayer but for warning, as though sound alone could hold back the shadows. Families huddled together, whispering psalms into the darkness, but still the cradles emptied. Still the corpses returned filled with salt and silence. By midsummer, Hohenberg was no longer a village but a wound. Fields lay untended, homes abandoned by families who fled in secret. The few who remained drifted through, the streets like ghosts, their eyes hollow, their faith broken. And in the center of it all was Elias, a child no longer seen as human but as a vessel. One who carried in his frail body the memory of every death the circle demanded. The collapse was not marked by fire or battle. It was marked by silence, by the sound of cradles rocking with no child inside, by the prayers that no longer seemed to reach heaven. And in that silence Elias whispered the truth none could bear. I am not alone. They are still here. By the end of that cursed summer, the people of Hohenberg could endure no more. With each vanished child, with each salted corpse returned to the earth, the whispers turned to shouts and the shouts to demands. They wanted an end, and in their fear, they chose a scapegoat. The boy who remembered what he should not. The boy who walked with the silence of graves in his eyes. They wanted Elias. The council of elders, pressed by grieving parents and emboldened by the priest's faltering faith, called for a trial. The word itself was a mask, for all knew it was not justice they sought, but deliverance. The chapel, once a place of prayer, was stripped of its icons and set for judgment. Rough benches lined the nave, the crucifix draped in cloth as if Christ himself could not watch. Torches smoked against the rafters, their light casting shadows that twisted across stone. Elias was brought forth, a child of 10, thin from coughs, pale from sleepless nights. He did not fight as they placed him upon the bench. His small hands rested in his lap, folded neatly, his eyes lowered yet unafraid. His mother wept at the sight, her cries smothered by her husband's hand, for fear that even sympathy would be taken as guilt. The accusations were shouted by many, each voice heavy with grief. They cried that Elias cursed their children with his gaze, that his whispered memories were not gifts but poisons. They claimed Marta had spoken the truth before her death, that Elias was not born but made, a vessel of evil experiments. And though no proof was offered, the sight of so many small graves was proof enough for them. Father Anselm stood as judge, though his heart was torn near to breaking. He looked at Elias and saw not a demon, but a boy broken by weight he had never chosen. Yet when the villagers screamed for condemnation, he felt his voice tremble with weakness. He asked Elias to speak, to answer for himself. The boy raised his head. His eyes, dark and sorrowful, swept the hall. I never asked for this, he whispered. His voice carried with an authority beyond his years, each word echoing through the nave. I did not steal them, I did not hollow them, I only remember. I was born twice, and both times I was made to carry what is not mine. A silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Some felt pity stir in their hearts, but others clenched their fists tighter. The miller's wife rose, her face streaked with tears, and screamed, "Then why do you know how they died? Why do you speak their names before they are taken? Elias lowered his gaze again. Because the memory finds me, it does not stop. The words chilled even Father Anselm. He remembered the chamber, the symbols, the waxen mannequins, the blood stains that would not fade. He knew the boy's claim was true. Elias was not a murderer, but a vessel, the echo of a crime older than the village itself. Yet truth mattered little before grief. The council moved to declare the child guilty of witchcraft, his life to be ended before more deaths came. It was then that Father Anselm did the unthinkable. He rose, his hands trembling, his voice breaking as he confessed. He told the villagers of the circle of the second womb, of the experiments in binding memory to flesh, of the chamber hidden beneath the chapel. He admitted that the church had once known, that records had been buried but never destroyed. "This boy is not our curse," he cried, "but our victim. His life is proof of sins we let grow in silence." The hall erupted in chaos. Some wept, others screamed, torn between horror and disbelief. Yet Anselm's confession did not free Elias. Instead, it deepened the wound. For now they saw not only a cursed child, but a child born of their own sanctuary's corruption. The guilt was unbearable, and guilt demanded blood. Elias remained still through it all. His face carried no fear, only sorrow. When the shouts grew loudest, he turned his gaze to the priest and whispered so softly only Anselm heard, "They will not let me go, because if I live, they must remember." The trial ended without verdict, but with decision. The boy's innocence mattered little. His very existence was a reminder too heavy for them to bear. And so the village, in its hunger for peace, prepared to kill the only innocent left among them. The judgment of the village was never written in law, never carved in ink. It was carried out in whispers, in torches lit at dusk, in the shuffling of feet toward the square where Elias was brought. He was 12 now, frail but composed, his thin body racked with the coughs that had plagued him since Marta's dissection. His skin was pale as milk, his veins visible as faint blue threads beneath it, but his eyes remained steady, unbroken, as if he had already accepted what the others could not. They tied him to a wooden post, the same one used to tether animals for slaughter. The villagers gathered, their faces shadowed by firelight, their grief and rage boiling together into something that felt holy to them. His mother pleaded, throwing herself at their feet, but she was dragged away. His father stood rigid, his jaw clenched, too broken to speak. Father Anselm tried once more to intervene, but his words drowned beneath the shouts. The people had decided the cycle would end with Elias. But the cycle did not end. It began again. When the first torch was raised, Elias convulsed violently. His body twisted against the ropes, not in fear, but in seizure. Blood erupted from his mouth and nose, pouring down his chest in rivulets. His skin split at the pores, beads of crimson forming until it seemed every part of him bled. The villagers recoiled, many dropping their torches in horror. The boy screamed, not in words, but in a sound that was both infantile and ancient, a cry like the one at his birth, fractured into two voices, one high, one low, as if two throats spoke through the same body. His body thrashed, ropes straining until the wood creaked. Then came the silence, a moment when all breath seemed stolen from the air. Elias's eyes rolled back, and in that instant his small frame collapsed, his head slumping forward. It seemed the boy had died, but before relief could settle, his lips parted. A whisper escaped, faint but unmistakable. A woman's name. None in the crowd knew it, but Anselm felt his blood freeze. It was not the name of any villager, not of anyone alive. It was a name yet to be, a name belonging to someone unborn. Elias exhaled one last time, his body falling limp. Blood pooled at his feet, dark and metallic, carrying with it the smell of iron and salt. His death should have ended the terror, but instead it left a wound that bled deeper than before. For his final words were not confession nor denial. They were prophecy. The body was buried quickly, as though haste might erase the memory of what had happened. No prayers were spoken over him, no hymns sung. His grave was shallow, marked only with a crooked stone. The villagers went about their days in silence, convincing themselves the evil was gone. But at night, when sleep faltered, they heard again the sound of his convulsions, the twin cry that echoed from birth to death. Years passed, and the story of Elias faded into the margins of whispered cautionary tales. The village thinned, some families fleeing, others vanishing in famine and war. By the dawn of a new century, Hohenberg was little more than a memory itself. But the prophecy did not fade. In 1912, in Munich, a baby girl was born to a young seamstress. The delivery was long, the labor brutal. But when the child came forth, she opened her eyes at once, wide and unclouded. She screamed, but the scream broke halfway, splitting into two voices, one high, one low. The midwife gasped, crossing herself. And when the exhausted mother tried to soothe her, the infant turned her head sharply, staring into her mother's face with a gaze far too deliberate. Then, before she had even been fed, the baby whispered. Not a cry, not a gurgle, but a single phrase that chilled every soul in the room. The cellar, the salt. The midwife dropped the child. The seamstress shrieked. And thus, the cycle began again. The story of Elias did not end with his grave. It lingered, hidden in the archives of church and state, carried in whispers that survived long after the village of Hohenberg itself faded into ruin. By the time the 20th century dawned, the stones of the chapel had crumbled, the fields overgrown, the graves unmarked. But in dusty drawers of diocesan offices, in sealed envelopes never meant to be opened, Elias remained. His name, his strange birth, his violent end, all recorded in trembling hands. When the records were finally unsealed more than a century later, historians recoiled at what they read. They found testimony of the circle of the second womb, descriptions of chambers carved beneath holy ground, of bodies hollowed and salted. They found sketches of Marta's scars, crude but undeniable, proof that cruelty had been systematic, not rumor. And they found Father Anselm's confession written in desperate scrawl before his death. The boy was not cursed. He was proof. We killed him to bury ourselves. A memorial was built in Munich, modest in stone but heavy in silence. It bore no names, only a single phrase, Erinnerung atmet weiter. Memory breathes on. Flowers gathered at its base each spring, though few spoke aloud the story. Parents brought their children, but their words faltered when asked why. Some whispered of Elias, others of unnamed infants who carried lives that were not their own. But most said nothing at all, as if silence itself were safer. Yet silence never stopped the cycle. Reports surfaced, scattered across decades, of children born speaking words they could not know, of infants who recoiled from their mother's touch, of toddlers who named streets they had never walked. Each case was dismissed, explained away as imagination, coincidence, madness. But in the shadows of those dismissals, the circle's theory pulsed still. Memory stronger than the grave, carried forward in blood. Philosophers who studied the case drew a darker conclusion. Evil, they said, does not always roar. It does not always burn villages or march with banners. More often it works in silence, in laboratories, in locked cellars, in the hands of those who tell themselves they serve progress. Elias had been born into such silence, raised in it, killed by it, and in silence his memory found another womb. The documentary closes with this weight. The camera lingers on the empty ruins of Hohenberg, on the memorial stone in Munich, on the image of a cradle swaying with no child inside. A voice asks not whether Elias was real nor whether his memories were possible, but something harder. What do you think? Could this happen again? The answer, unspoken yet heavy in the air, is yes. Because silence is fertile and memory never truly dies.